Prepare for a rude awakening.
Shalom, Torah fans. This is Michael Rood welcoming you to episode 1 in the 11-part series, The Creator's Calendar and the Restoration of All Things. Shimon Kefa, Simon Peter, prophesied on the very day that the disciples were first baptized with the Holy Spirit, Yahshua has ascended into heaven until the restoration of all things. One of the all things that is now being restored is the Creator's original calendar, the reckoning of time by which the Almighty created and still runs the universe. This is the same calendar by which Israel conducted the temple service, and the reckoning of time that governed when Yahshua went up to Jerusalem to fulfill the spring feast of the Lord. Now, after nearly 2,000 years of religious superstition and ignorance, we can begin to understand the ministry of the Messiah and the gospel chronology with more precise detail than could have been imagined since the onset of the Dark Ages. Both the Jews and the Christians have forsaken the Creator's calendar for an invented reckoning of time. The modern Jewish calendar was invented in the village of Tiberias in the year 359 of the Common Era. It utilized Babylonian astronomical mathematics to calculate the moment of the sun-moon conjunction, with amazing accuracy for the time, but the moment of conjunction never was and never will be the means by which the Creator establishes his reckoning of time. Alternatively, the modern Christian calendar remains just as pagan as the day it was invented in Babylon, nearly 4,000 years ago. In this A Rude Awakening series, we shed both of these man-made calendars and turn to the ancient Hebrew scriptures to discover the Creator's reckoning of time, so that we, the children of light, might not be ignorant of his times and his seasons. The Creator's calendar and the Feast of the Lord are detailed prophetic shadow pictures of good things to come.
We live in an amazing time of restoration. For nearly 2,000 years, the Jewish people were scattered across the lands of the dispersion, and now we're back in the land of Israel.
A Rude Awakening Television presents The Creator's Calendar and the Restoration of All Things. A special presentation from Israel by Michael Rood and Nehemiah Gordon.
Shalom. This is Michael Rood in the hill country of Judea, welcoming you to this teaching on the Creator's calendar and the restoration of all things. The hill country of Judea is just one small part of the parcel of land that was promised to Abraham, his sons Isaac and Jacob, a parcel of land that goes all the way from the river Euphrates in modern-day Iraq to the great river in Egypt. Just before coming into this parcel of land, Moses gave us final instructions just before his death. And in those instructions, he told us that when we come into this land, we are not to be contaminated by the worship of the pagans that inhabited this area. It was the sons of Canaan, the grandson of Noah, that came in and settled this land. And when they came out of Babylon at the time of the confusion of languages, it was at that time that they brought their Babylonian sun god worship with them into this land. Also, the sexual perversion that Noah cursed Canaan for to begin with was also a part of their lifestyle. And so Moses, giving his final instructions, said that when you come into this land, you are not to learn the way of the heathen. You are not to learn how they worship and serve their gods and do the same thing and say you're doing it for me. He said, do not even let the name of their pagan gods come out of your mouth. You are to go into this land and expunge it of every last vestige of pagan sun god worshipers that the Canaanites brought into this parcel of land. Now, he also said that after he died, he knew by revelation that we were going to break the covenant that was made with us at Mount Sinai. We were not going to keep the commandments. We were going to add commandments to the instructions that we received from the Almighty. We were going to take away commandments. We were going to get contaminated by the world. He knew it. He spoke of these things. And he said that he was going to give us a song. We refer to it as the Song of Moses. And this song was to be repeated throughout our generations, and it was something that was going to remind us of something very important. That when we come into this land and we do get contaminated by the worship of these pagans and their pagan sun god worship, contaminated by their reckoning of time, which is based on the worship of other gods, he said that the Almighty was going to throw us out of this land, that we would be cast abroad throughout all the nations of the world. And when we are in our exile, we are going to see that the Almighty, it's as if he turns his back on us, and we don't even see him, but we do see that he fulfills his word. Now, when we are in our exile, and we are contaminated among the nations, we are no longer fulfilling our job as his priest, his representatives to the entire world. He said that at that time, this land would become a desolate wasteland. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. We are standing among the terraces that 2,000 years ago were planted. There were olive yards, there were vineyards. It was a beautiful area that people made their livelihood for thousands of years. But all of this was destroyed. And in the Song of Moses, it actually tells us that Gentiles will come from the far ends of the earth to this land and say, this is nothing but a wasteland. This is desolate. And it is because the Almighty has obviously punished his people. Well, I believe it was in the mid-1860s that a man named Samuel Langhorne Clemens, whose pen name, Mark Twain, one of the most prolific and popular authors in the world at that time, came to the land of Israel. And he reported to the entire world that this is nothing but a desolate wasteland, that very few things grew here. And as I'm standing among the thorns and thistles even here today, just a little ways away, there are now olive yards, there are vineyards, there are plantings that are going on. And behind me, these trees behind me, they have been planted by the millions. It is growing up green all over the land of Israel again because the Almighty said he would bring his people back into this land in the last days, and he would restore all things. There is a prophesied restoration of all things, and it doesn't come very easily. It comes from working among the thorns. It comes from slaving out under the hot sun to plant millions of trees. And it's one step at a time as the restoration takes place. Now, the prophet Isaiah prophesied that in the last days that Israel, which would be spread among the nations abroad, would finally come back into their land and become a nation again in one day. Now, many theologians, in fact, most Western theologians 100 years ago said that this will never happen again. Israel will never become a nation again because God has forsaken Israel. All of the covenants that God made with Israel are null and void. He has cast them aside. He's divorced them. He has nothing to do with Israel. Now he only deals with Gentiles who call themselves Christians. Yet there was a very large group of people that said, if God can break his everlasting covenants with Israel, then no one is on safe ground. They said that Israel will in fact become a nation again in one day. Now we look back just a half century and see that on May 15th, 1948, Israel did indeed become a nation in one day. That did not come without a lot of pain and without a lot of bloodshed. A lot of work has gone into restoring the things that we left behind over 2,000 years ago. And part of that restoration is the Creator's calendar, a calendar that the world basically knows nothing about, but yet it is in every page of the Hebrew Scriptures. We are living in God's universe. The world in which we live is synchronized to God's calendar and God's time clock. Whether we know about it, recognize it, live by it or not, does not make any difference to the Almighty. I learned long ago that He does not spin the universe around what I don't understand. If I get in the way, it seems like things just continue to roll on over me. But we in the Western world have grown up in complete ignorance of the Creator's calendar, of His time clock, which is clearly detailed in the pages of the Scriptures. And we have inherited a pagan reckoning of time in which every day of the week is named after a different pagan god. Every month of the year is named after a different fallen angel. Days, weeks, months, and years all begin and end on completely fictitious points in time. It's as if the hands have been stripped from the face of the clock. We have no idea what time it is, but the Almighty knows what time it is. And He has a plan and a destiny for this planet and a destiny for mankind. He has made promises that He Himself will fulfill, whether we're awake, whether we're asleep, whether we realize it or not. He is the one that rules the universe, and He will bring to pass His promises. And in the last days, He is going to fulfill His promise to Abraham, that all of the land, from the great river Euphrates in Iraq, all the way to the river in Egypt, will belong to the sons of Israel. And these are the days that we are now living in, because there will be a restoration of all things. When we have grown up in complete ignorance of God's reckoning of time, which is clearly detailed in the Hebrew Scriptures, and we have inherited this pagan reckoning of time, along with it we have inherited the reckoning of time that was put in place in Babylon by Babylonian sun god worshipers. And this reckoning of time was instituted, and it was calculated to go along with the worship of Nimrod, the great grandson of Canaan. And so it's time that we strip away some of this pagan sun god worship, not only the reckoning of time, but also their celebrations, their honoring of their gods, and we go back and understand what the Creator of the heavens and the earth has asked of us and how it is that we are supposed to live. Now, I am going to invite you to go with me into a record in the Scriptures, in the Brit Hadashah, the renewed covenant, in which Shaul told us some very important things about the Creator's reckoning of time. In 1 Thessalonians, we are going to read in the 5th chapter a very important scripture concerning the Creator's reckoning of time. Now, I am going to be reading from the King James Version of the Bible. The King James happens to be my favorite version of the Bible because English is my mother tongue. This is what I grew up with. This Bible that I have in my hands, I have had in my hands now for over 31 years. So I've gotten to be very familiar with where these words are on the page. And it is a quadruple wide margin on my Bible, which means that I have ample room to write in all of the margins. I'll never replace this. And the King James Version of the Bible will always be my favorite because in 1611, when the King James translators translated from the original text and brought it into the language of the common people in England, they did so with a very distinct purpose, and that is so that we would have the words from the original languages into a language that the people could read and understand. Now, in 1611, the English language was a lot different from what it is today. The usage of the words has changed drastically since that time. And so when I read in the English version of the Bible, when I read certain things that I don't quite understand, the first thing that I do is that I pull out an old Webster's Dictionary of the Bible. In fact, for each one of my daughters, when they reached a certain age, then I got them an old Webster's Dictionary And the reason why I got them in Webster's dictionary is because Noah Webster was a serious Bible student. Now, many of us recognize Noah Webster as the man, the scholar in America, who standardized the spelling of the English language. And that was a great accomplishment in itself. But I was in Noah Webster's home, which is now in Greenfield Village in Detroit, and there, under a case, is the handwritten translation that Noah did from the ancient Hebrew and the ancient Greek into the English language. Noah Webster said that that was the most important accomplishment of his entire life, to translate the Bible from its ancient languages into English. Now, why that is important for us today is that of all the accomplishments of Noah Webster, he said that that was the most important accomplishment. It's because in Webster's dictionary, he uses the English language and he also gives the definitions that fit with the ancient Hebrew and the ancient Greek. My particular favorite version of Webster's dictionary is the 1825 edition, the International Edition, which already assumes that you understand the Greek language. That's a good place to start. And when I read the English scriptures, I need to have an old Webster's dictionary. Now, when we don't quite understand what is written because of the English being archaic and sometimes we see things that don't quite fit, then the King James Version allows me to go back to the original languages very quickly because most of the research in the Western world, biblical research, has been done using the King James English version of the Bible, so then it goes back to the original languages. So when we see something that does not quite fit, either in our modern usage of the English language or because it just doesn't fit with the context, then we can take a step back into the ancient languages, and it's done very simply. And there are a few things that I appreciate that modern English doesn't have. Ye in Old English is the plural of you. In modern English, we don't use the plural of you, and so sometimes we're lost when we read the scriptures to know even who it's speaking of. Another thing about the 1611 King James Version of the Bible, by the way, it's not a translation. The translators made a word-by-word translation of the original languages, and then they worked to produce a version. Now, a version is when they take that translation and then form it into the proper grammar and syntax in the language in which it is speaking. I like working with translations, but it takes sometimes hours to read just a simple chapter. But in the King James Version, we are given something that's very easy in English to read. Now, in 1630, the Bible scholars in England asked the King James Version people to do something very special. Whenever the King James Version translators added words into the Bible in order to try to make it make sense in the English language, they did not denote any time that they made an addition, added a word. So in 1630, then they produced a version in which they put italics in the King James Version to let us know when the translators added words, added phrases that were not in the original, so that we would know that they added them in an attempt to clarify things, but realizing that that's not originally what it said. Another reason I like the King James Version is that in 1611, the letter J did not exist in the alphabet. It was about 25 years later that the letter J was added to the English alphabet and was put right after the letter Y. Why? Because the letter I has a I sound in English. The letter J has the Y sound in English. And even today, over in Europe, you don't speak of Mr. Jorgensen, it is Mr. Jorgensen, even though it's spelled with a J. When you go to Yugoslavia or go to Europe, you see that Yugoslavia is spelled with a capital J. It is the Y sound. And since there is no J sound in the Hebrew language, every time you come to the letter J in the King James Version of the Bible, when you pronounce it properly as the letter Y or Y, then you are going to be very close to the original. Such as Joshua. It's not Joshua, it is Yahshua, which is the shortened version of Yehoshua, which is Yahweh is our salvation. So anytime you see the letter J in your King James Version of the Bible, pronounce it as a Y, and you'll be very close. There are many, many things in this version of the Bible that I appreciate, but most of it is that I've had the same Bible for now over 30 years, and if there are things that needed to be studied and worked on, most likely I already have them in the margins of my scriptures, because I have had questions about the Bible as I began reading it as a young student, 17 years of age, and seriously studying the scriptures that I would pray for the answer to. Sometimes it would take decades for me to get the answer. Sometimes I had to go for 20 years to unlearn things that I had been taught as a youth, and to see a different picture develop in the scripture to where finally I understood the answer. And I will never forget, as a young man, as I was seriously studying the book of Revelation and opening the book of Revelation in the letters to the assemblies at Ephesus, it said that Yahshua hated the doctrine and the deeds of the Nicolaitans. He further praised the believers in Ephesus, saying that you hate them as well, and that you are doing well. And when I read that, I knew that I wanted to understand the doctrine and the deeds of the Nicolaitans. And I read everything I could. Nothing made any sense. Nothing added up. Why does Yahshua hate this? Why does he passionately hate it? And he praises those who hate it as well. Well, I prayed in earnest prayer at that time that I would understand what it is that Yahshua hated so much, because I wanted to at least be on the same page he was. And since the book of Revelation was written to the servants of the Messiah, who need to know the things which must come to pass in the last days, I feeling that these may be the last days, and since I only have one life to live, whatever days I live are my last days anyway, but I wanted to understand this. But you know what happened? When I prayed that prayer, I had no idea that for about a decade I would be plunged into the depths of a Nicolaitan system, a Nicolaitan hierarchy, one of a prolific cult in America that manipulated, intimidated people. And when I got involved in that system and saw it from the inside, then I began to understand at that point what the doctrine and the deeds of the Nicolaitans were. And because I went through that, I then was able to help thousands and tens of thousands of people who are incarcerated in that same type of system, that same religious system, to get set free from it. I have friends who were in that system, in that cult, who are dead today. They committed suicide. I nearly lost my life. I actually lost my first marriage because of it. But through the course of that, the Almighty answered my prayer. Because of my experience in this religious cult, I am now able to effectively teach against the doctrines and the deeds of the Nicolaitans in a way that I could never have imagined if I had not gone through that. Unless I'd gone through that dark valley that brought me to the point of death in my life, I would never be able to do what I'm doing today. So now, let us open our Bibles, and I'll be reading out of the King James Version, 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 1. But of the times and seasons, brethren, you have no need that I write unto you, for you yourselves know perfectly. Wait, let's stop there for just a minute. The times and seasons, that particular phrase in English is also from the Greek, chronos and kairos. And that terminology is not only used throughout the Brit Hadashah, or as some people call it, the New Testament, but it is also found throughout the Greek translation of the Torah and the prophets, which is known as the Septuagint. The times and seasons refer to the Creator's reckoning of time. And the word seasons is the word in the Hebrew, moedim, which are the appointed times of the Lord. These are what is also referred to as the feast of the Lord. Now, if we in the Western world have grown up in complete ignorance of the Creator's reckoning of time, then when it comes to his appointed times, we also find ourselves completely ignorant in that capacity as well. In the Western world, we have basically adopted pagan sun god worship festivals that have nothing to do with truth or reality, and we've grown up knowing nothing about the feast of the Lord, which Paul says they are all prophetic shadow pictures of good things to come. They are literally the mechanism whereby the Almighty has told us the end from the beginning. And if we have grown up in ignorance of these feasts, which are detailed prophetic shadow pictures, then when we open the pages of the first four Gospels, we find ourselves understanding maybe 5% of the vast knowledge that is there. Because the Gospels did not fall out of a clear blue sky. The Gospels, the first four Gospels, are literally the fulfillment as Yahshua, the Messiah, fulfills the spring feast of the Lord. And it is showing him fulfilling the spring feast of the Lord to the very day, the very hour, the exact moment, in every detail, which we rehearsed them in the temple for over 1,000 years. The fifth Gospel, the book of Revelation, details how the Messiah will fulfill the fall feast of the Lord to the very day, the very hour, the exact moment, in every detail. The first four Gospels detail the fulfillment of the spring feast of the Lord, while the fifth Gospel, the good news of the revelation of the Messiah as the conquering king, details how the Messiah will fulfill the fall feast of the Lord. Join us again next time as we continue our adventure of discovering the Creator's calendar and the restoration of all things. This is Michael Rood bidding you shalom, peace, and I will see you when the smoke clears.